So first of all, I'd like to welcome all people out in television land, if anybody's watching this from a distance. A couple of sort of administrative / caveat comments. One is that I'm going to have to be leaving this meeting today, unfortunately. I'm sorry I can't stay to the end. I have to fly out to another meeting in San Francisco. So I'll be taking off in the afternoon, so bid you farewell now. Second one is I'm really sorry that I didn't get my paper in time for you to not download it and read it. But I will actually be finishing the paper, and this talk has actually been a forcing function to try to get my head around some of these issues. I think I finally figured out what I want to say. Now, most of what I'm still working on comes toward the end of the talk, and I'll explain what's going on there. And then just to kind of jump into the subject matter, you'll notice that the talk is listed as Integration, Complexity, and Distributed Requirements, and I've changed that title to Coordination, Complexity, and Distributed Requirements. And I'll explain why I made that switch. It's kind of a core thing in my thinking over the last 15 years or so. I actually am a pretty serious opponent of integration. I think integration is a very major problem in this business, and that moving away from integration is something we're going to have to do to make the whole issue of requirements more tractable. So let's go ahead and get started. I want to kind of begin with the observation that a lot of requirements is, of course, about communication. And I have a little clip, a video clip I want to show you that sort of illustrates this point. If I can get this to work.
Booyakasha, wayasa liki yawan gagat. Respect is important, but the sad thing is there's so little respect left in the world that if you look up the word behind me in the dictionary, you'll find it's been taken out.
Okay, that's Ollie G, if you've never seen the show. And he's a Sacha Baron Cohen. He's the guy who does Borat. And this was one of his other characters. And I like that clip because it basically says, this is something that's really important. Of course, he's coming at it from his own understanding, his own spelling of the word and everything, which is, of course, part of his gag. So, when I first started thinking hard about this topic for this particular paper, I decided to go to my primary source material, which of course is Wikipedia, and I looked up requirement, and it said see need. For other kinds of requirements, see need. This article is about engineering. For other kinds of requirements, see need. So I went to need, and it said, for Stargate 1, SG-1 episode, see need. But I wanted to sort of point to an interesting thing about this write-up about requirements. In engineering, a requirement is a singular documented need of what a particular product or service should be or do, et cetera, et cetera. And it's all aimed to have value and utility to a user. And the thing that struck me about that was you don't usually find that many singular constraints in a single short burst of words. That it's a singular documented need, a particular product or service. It's all headed to a user. And I think the issue that's at hand for us in this business of large institutionalized systems, particularly systems that serve heterogeneous communities of people, is first of all that there's no such thing as the user. That's a fiction in the kinds of systems I'm talking about. What we've done in the requirements world, quite successfully in some cases, but very dismally in others, is adopt a mechanism in which you can make presumptions about the singularity of purpose of things and try to generalize that to circumstances in which much more heterogeneous groups of people are going to be using the system. So I want to kind of walk through this. Now, this hasn't been an easy thing to deal with even when we have very particular needs. Let's assume that we have a user, a single user, and it's well known that the requirements problem is hard to solve. You've all seen this thing, right? This I first saw a version of this when my dad was working for NASA back in the early 1970s. Apparently it originated in the UK. That's the sort of folklore about it, is that it originated in the UK, made its way across the Atlantic, and of course it was posted in a lot of cubicle walls and office walls as mimeographs or photocopies, primarily in the engineering world, right? And it illustrates a kind of classic conundrum, which is, you know, the marketing people have one idea of what the relationship with the customer is, and the manufacturing people have a different idea, and there's a lot of communication breakdown in the process, and, you know, what the user wanted was, you know, something very simple, and what's finally delivered is crazy, and there's been all this trouble along the way. Now, of course, nothing can be left alone. Even this cartoon has had mission creep. So this is the latest version of the cartoon I could find. It's actually kind of hilarious. Since I like what the consultant described edition, I think that's good, and what the customer was billed for. But you know, this whole issue of requirements, the difficulty of requirements has been in the folklore for so long that it's a testimony, a kind of a signifier to us that this problem has been very deep for a long time. This is not a new problem. And this is dealing with what the customer wanted, right? You're still talking about a singular target customer. How much harder is it when you try to hit a heterogeneous audience? Well, what do we know about this problem? The first and important thing to recognize is that we have existence proofs that we actually can hit heterogeneous audiences with things that they relate to and understand and get a hold of. So for example, people whose faces we don't readily recognize are capable of creating faces that we do readily recognize. Right? The appeal of the Mona Lisa is universal. 4 centuries after Leonardo painted this painting, it's an iconic picture. Everybody knows this picture, right? And it's not because of marketing. It's because there's something about that picture, the way he painted it, what's there, it's very hard to explain what it is, attracts people to it and they recognize it. You might call this kind of thing as the creation of a universal standard, right? The Mona Lisa constitutes a kind of benchmark. So I want to play a little clip about standards.
Well, to create a new standard, it takes something that's not just a little bit different. It takes something that's really new and really captures people's imagination. And the Macintosh, of all the machines I've ever seen, is the only one that meets that standard.
If you look at Apple's products, one of the things that attracts you to them, one of the things that attracts people to them generally is their design characteristics. I was in a meeting out in Cupertino not long ago, and we had a lucky break in this group. We actually got to spend about an hour and a half with Jonathan Ive, who's in the picture there. Ive is the chief designer for Apple. He's the one who created, for example, the iPod. And it was very interesting listening to him talk. I mean, it comes back to this issue of what Leonardo was able to do. And I'm not equating Ive with Leonardo, but there was something very fascinating in the way he talked about things. People basically asked him, kind of, how do you do what you do? And he did something that I've never seen a person in his kind of position do before. He looked around the room and he started picking up objects, objects that were obviously not planted. And he started telling you what was going on with the design of these objects. And one of the things that he picked was this Apple screen, the 24-inch flat panel screen. He said, if you look at what's important about this screen, he talked about several things. The thing that was really important about the screen is the base. He said the base of other screens look clunky. And as you can see in the picture, this is truly true. He said part of our theme in the design of all of these products, but this one was where it showed up for purposes of his illustration, is we wanted to make these key components out of single pieces of material. So that base is a single piece of aluminum that's been bent, right? It's a very, very simple design. But it turns out, in order to make that design effective, there's a resonance frequency of aluminum. And one of the problems is if you hit that screen, it's a spring, right? The aluminum bounces back and forth. He said the hardest part was spending like 8 months looking for the little kind of rubbery feet that go on the bottom of it, because they had to be of a certain polymeric density so that they damped the oscillations of the spring motion of the stand, right? Now, this is not something that I would have ever thought of, right? But as he was kind of going around the room picking things up and illustrating it, he was pointing out that this is the nature of the problem. Now, this is something that we can all relate to. You know, we all know how irritating it would be if that thing was bouncing when we were trying to watch it. And obviously, this is something they had to fix. This was a direct consequence. The spring problem was a direct consequence of their desire to have that stand made out of a single piece of material, right? So in order to accomplish one design objective, which is sort of simplicity, elegance, etc., they introduced a problem, which was this resonance frequency and the springiness, and then they had to solve that through some other mechanism. If you look at the difference between the iPod and the Zune, which is, you know, Microsoft's MP3 player, it's really quite interesting. As soon as the Zune came out, I went and found one that they would actually let you hold. I mean, when they were first released, they were in scarce supply, and they were sort of, no, you give us the money, and then we'll take it out from behind the counter and let you have it, like, you know, a drug dealer or something. And but I finally got to a place where they allowed me to pick it up and feel it. And you know what? It felt like a Microsoft product. Right? I've had iPods for quite a while. I like them, as you can see. I'm a Mac user. But it was so weird to pick this thing up, and it's like, yeah, this came from Microsoft, you know? And that's why I don't want it. Right? And if you've noticed, the Zune isn't selling. Right? Now, there's lots of ways Microsoft could address this. This is one. This was a picture that was taken by some guys who were going through the Zune development group at Microsoft, and these guys had put this amnesty bin up, the iPod amnesty bin, and as you can see, there's, you know, discarded iPods lying in there, and, you know, this whole idea of sort of amnesty for using an iPod evokes a kind of design consciousness on the part of Microsoft. And of course, you know, this turned out to be a stupid thing to do because it was immediately picked up by the tech press, and, you know, then, you know, they made this story out of it about how much hubris was involved there. So when you ask, I mean, okay, it's one thing to just stumble into all of these problems, to make these kinds of mistakes, to dig yourself into this kind of hole design-wise. How do you try to understand how to create this push phenomenon, this where you push this stuff out into the world and make it successful for very large numbers of people who not only haven't seen this thing before, but say in the case of the iPod, they never even thought of the idea. It never even occurred to them, except it's actually kind of like a Sony Walkman, which when it came out was another thing that they had never heard of before and never seen before, but it was enormously successful. And as you might notice, Sony lost the franchise on portable music, which they created and owned for quite a while, because they didn't get it. They didn't stay with the technology. They didn't stay with rolling this forward and move it into the digital era. They stayed in the analog era. If you want to understand this, this phenomenon of distributed requirements, it's helpful to just do a simple distinction between supply push and demand pull phenomena. Supply push is what's happened with Leonardo's Mona Lisa, what's happened with Apple designs like the iPod. Somehow people with extraordinary skill make things that connect to people through some sort of universal appeal. It's an extraordinary art. It's an extraordinary talent. It's very, very hard to do that. And it's especially hard to do that if you've got something that's purposive in mind in order to enable what the end user would prefer to do, right? It's one thing to, I mean, this is one of Apple's traditions, right? It's their closed architecture, right? It's like, we know better than you do what you need. I mean, you know, Apple is far more arrogant than Microsoft in this respect. It's like, we're going to give you what you need, you're going to like it, end of discussion. right? The strange thing is you actually do like it, right? Microsoft says, how about this? How about that? How about this? How about that? That's not a good enough feature? How about 9 more? You can choose between them. Oh, you don't know what they are? Well, we're going to make you find out. We're going to put a paperclip on this to tell you about it, right? So, you know, they're coming at you like a fire hose. How do you try to get across this hurdle where you're no longer in supply push, you're actually in demand pull, where the people out in the distributed community, the heterogeneous base of users, actually are trying to pull what they would like to do from your capability to them? That's a much harder thing to do, and that's what distributed requirements is really trying to do in most cases. Because, frankly, in most cases, not only do we not have the genius designer who can just design the thing, we're actually trying to create capabilities that are themselves heterogeneous out in the user space. So let's just look at a glance back at some historical technology evolution that we all know pretty well, and just, you know, sort of watch the kinds of trouble that we get into when we just take this thing on a random walk. Now, you all remember, you know, Edison invented the Victrola, and the record industry was born, the recording music industry was born, and the standards, if you will, that were in very wide distribution, very wide use when I came on the scene in the 1950s were the, you know, plastic discs that you would play with phonograph styluses in the 45 and the LP record. The 78, you know, was a little bit before my time, and then of course the wax cylinders and all were even earlier. Well, not too long after that, the plastic disc ran into some trouble in the form of home-based magnetic recording, analog magnetic recording, starting with reel-to-reel tape decks, which were basically the province of aficionados. They were expensive and a hassle to use. But not too long after, the compact cassette was invented, and people began, with their home stereo systems, to shift the music off of the LP records and onto these audio tapes. Now, the quality wasn't very high. You didn't have as good a fidelity, but most people didn't have stereo systems that were particularly high fidelity anyway. So this actually turned out to be a good thing. And of course, these audio cassettes, if you had a cassette player, you could record these things. You could share them with your friends. You could play them in your car and so forth. And you used to find a sticker on blank cassettes. It wasn't on all of them, but some of the companies were running this, putting this sticker on. You know, home taping is killing music, you know, and it's illegal down at the bottom. It was a copyright violation. But you know, the recording industry saw rent dissipation through this mechanism, and it kind of freaked them out. But then something happened. They decided to go digital, and they made a huge amount of money going digital, because when they went digital, they were able to take not only the new recordings and put them onto this superior medium, which was much higher fidelity, didn't have the problems of the scratches and so forth of the LPs. It was actually much cheaper to produce too. But they could also take their entire backlist and remaster it and convert it into CDs, and in the process get new rent off of the existing material that they own, the existing IP they owned. So for example, Sgt. Pepper's on an LP could become Sgt. Pepper's on a CD. And the same thing's true of the White Album, right? I mean, all of your backlist could be converted to this new thing. And these companies made a huge amount of money reselling the IP that they already had. I've bought a ton of these things. You've probably bought a ton of these things, you know, reliving your lost youth. And this is enormously valuable. But again, there was this Achilles heel in this for the record companies. And of course, file sharing is killing music was the next result of this, because people found it easy to convert these CDs through a digital converter, like a computer, into files that could then be shared in the internet. And then something like Napster with peer-to-peer sharing comes along, and then alas, our youth are corrupted and they're downloading communism. So, you know, we have all around us these existence proofs that we can change the world with these technologies. The important thing to see is that we actually can do this, right? So if you look at these technologies that have been extraordinarily successful at creating a base on which all kinds of variants could operate. The Internet Highway System is a good example, by the way. There's the heterogeneity of vehicles and uses to which the interstate highway system is put is extraordinarily wide, much wider than you could get off of any kind of train, fixed rail system, or any kind of aircraft. The diversity is enormous, with respect to that infrastructure. The internet is a similar kind of iconic example. The interesting thing is we can do these, we know we can do them, we just can't do them on purpose. Right? In most of these cases that we look at and we point at and say, see, we've done this, we can do this again, that's where the error comes in. We actually know how to stumble onto it, or putting it differently, it seems like collectively we have that knowledge, although it's tacit and we can't explain what it is. But when it comes to designing these kinds of things, it turns out to be very difficult. What we end up with are sort of the two classic problems. To the person with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Right? And so people find like one solution that seemed to work in a given case, and then they drive that thing as hard as they can, and it doesn't work in other cases, or it's the drunk under the lamppost problem. Right? This is what we know how to do. This is how we know how to spend our time. So why can't we do this? Why is this so hard? And this is the guts of the current part of the paper that I'm trying to write. I think there's a class of problems under both coordination and complexity that illustrate how difficult this is. Let me start with complexity, because I think I want to throw that at the beginning of the title and follow with coordination. There's actually 3 kinds of complexity that we're dealing with when we deal with these heterogeneous need spaces. The first one is just simple combinatorial complexity. Obviously, the number of special instances you're going to have to deal with is going to go up as a function of the number of different points of view. And so when you're talking about designing something that's got to be used by 1,000 different, 10,000 different, 10 million different individuals, each of whom comes to it with a slightly different sense of what they think the thing is, you're going to have an explosion of possible outcomes. To plan for all of those is just unreachable. Right? So the idea of the sort of brute force strategy of integration, of systems integration, can't work. It actually becomes an enormous barrier to being able to do what you want to do. There's also a phenomenon called hierarchical complexity, which has to do with the ability of control structures, particularly hierarchical control structures, to react to variance. And then finally, there's the problem of indeterminacy. Because a lot of what's going on is emergent in these systems, people don't know what they want. Right? So not only, let's just say there's a canonical user, John Henderson. John Henderson has a market basket of needs that he wants to pull out of this capability. That market basket might change day by day. It's actually quite likely to change over time anyway, because as John gets a better understanding of what's possible, he'll change his views about what ought to be happening. Right? So this is, you go back to the single user design case, and you run into what every system developer who's ever tried to do requirements planning has run into, which is users don't know what they want until they know what they can get. How else could that be, right? So now you've got tens of thousands of people or millions of people who don't know what they know until they know what they can get, but they're learning. That's the problem with humans. They're learning all the time, and they're changing their views. And so the indeterminacy of what the need space is alone is an enormous driver of complexity. So the complexity part of this is extremely daunting. Now, on top of that, there's a number of other issues that have to do with social process coordination. And here I'll give my little spiel about systems integration. I'm a big fan of integration as far as it goes. And it's gone pretty far. If you look at the late 19th and most of the 20th century, process integration in the form of process engineering probably brought home most of the bacon of the second industrial revolution, right? Henry Ford's process engineering innovations in automobile production is a good example. It revolutionized how we make things. But there's a really core problem with integration as a form of social process coordination. That's what it is. It's a subset of social process coordination. And that problem is this. It's impossible to build integrated systems that are simultaneously robust and flexible. It just can't be done. The way you make an integrated system robust is through redundancy. And redundancy is axiomatically the enemy of flexibility. You can't change it. That's the whole point. It's designed to run the way it runs. It's not designed to run some other way, particularly some other way that you didn't think about. That's the key thing. Integration is a very supply push oriented design perspective. So, yeah, it's not surprising that we were drunk with the power of system integration during the 20th century. It allowed the moon mission and all these other kinds of things that were, let's face it, incredible feats. But look what happened with the technologies like the internet. That was a form of simplification. The way the internet made the world different was to say, you know what? We don't really care what happens at the edges. We're just going to try to make it real simple for stuff to interact. It was a gateway strategy as opposed to the old circuit switched bell system strategy for communication, right? So it was all like, we don't care what you do at the edges. If you just do these things at the meet point, everything will be okay. And it's not that with the first time. And again, the highway system was like that. So we've got, again, this is where the changing needs issues come in, but it's not just a changing perspective on what's possible, which is this indeterminacy thing. This is one that bridges. It's this phenomenon I call the social reconstruction of technology, or of reality. If you're familiar with the concept of the social construction of reality, it's not much of a step to say, yeah, you can have social reconstruction of technology. And the social reconstruction of technology is what we see as the primary driver of mission creep. And mission creep is, an enormous problem. We were talking about it in some of the examples, the FAA's Advanced Automation Program and so forth. Just things that get out of control because nobody has the authority within the social processes to say, you know what, we don't care about your preferences. This is how it's going to be. My dad worked for NASA, as I mentioned to some of you. And one of the things that he told me about once, he worked for Lewis Research and then for Marshall. And he actually got to know Wernher von Braun. And one of the things he said was most interesting about von Braun is part of the reason that the Apollo moon program stayed on target was von Braun educated all of the people who worked for him in the concept of final design review. And what they understood was, when you go through final design review, it doesn't matter if somebody the next day comes up with an engine that runs on seawater. If yesterday you approved the Jet A liquid oxygen engine, that's what you're going to go with. It doesn't matter if somebody came up. Flat wire cabling is a good example. That flat cable, ribbon cable, that was developed late in the development of the Saturn vehicle. The plan was to build it with all standard old spaghetti wiring. This flat cable would have saved tons of money. They didn't use it. They'd been through final design review. End of discussion. No innovation after final design review. We're planning now for pandemic flu, right? One of the things we're dealing with at our university. I'm part of that process. One of the things the systems people say is, as soon as we get a warning, no innovation. We back away from all of the systems and we let them run. If we stop touching them, they'll run longer. All right? That's a very interesting observation. The other two things I want to talk about here are what I call in-dimensional contracting. This is a really, really hard one. The best example is this FAA case. If you ask yourself what happened that sent the FAA Advanced Automation Program so far underwater, I'll tell you in one word. It's the mythology that the FAA controls airspace. They don't. They haven't controlled airspace for 40 years. Airspace is controlled by the commercial aviation industry for the simple reason that the commercial aviation industry is more important than the FAA to everybody, including the FAA. But because, these people who have this canonical model of authority, integration, hierarchy, and so forth, they were the ones who designed this thing. They said, well, who owns the airspace? Who controls airspace? Oh, the FAA. Okay, this makes that their project. They're the principal. They were never the principal. The airline industry was the principal. And of course, there is no airline industry. It's a bunch of players. Nobody could ever figure out the agency relations. And that's why the mission creep destroyed that project. My guess is it's probably past WMIX in terms of the largest net loss in a systems development contract in U.S. federal history. It's you know, I don't know, the bill's probably $20 billion in running at this point, and we still don't have anything. And then finally, there's this issue of brittleness. This is a really hard one, and this is one I'm still trying to work through, but it has to do with linguistic conventions, and it comes back to this issue of communication. If you're going to do contracting, everybody has to understand the language that you're using. Everybody has to understand the terms, right, and come into agreement. The way you do this is by developing control vocabularies. And control vocabularies are inherently brittle. I don't have enough time to really elaborate on this, but this is something that's been looked at a lot by people who do information retrieval, information organization and retrieval. If you define categories of meaning, you very quickly discover that the more tightly coupled, the more tightly bound the categories of meaning are, the quicker you find exceptions to them that challenge your control assumptions. And when that begins to happen in an n-dimensional space, an n-dimensional community, a heterogeneous community, you find very soon that you lose control of the language. And when you lose control of the language, you lose control. So that's where I am right now with this paper. You know, stay tuned. I'm going to keep trying to work on it between pandemic flu and the RIAA. And maybe one of these days soon, you'll actually see something up on the website and you can comment on it. Thanks.
We have time for one or two questions. If there are any more at this stage.
Yeah.
Yes, Fred.
John, your last point, have you read Clay Sharkey's Ontologies Are Overrated?
Yeah.
Have you seen it? Does it speak to the same
issue
you're getting at there?
It's the same general notion. This was, this is part of the reason it's been fun to be part of a school of information. You hang out with people you should never even know exist in business schools, including people who are trained in libraries and archives, right? One of the really interesting things about the archives world, and this is actually kind of a similar thing in between artifact collectors and physical anthropologists and archaeologists, right? I mean, what they choose to focus on is very different. Librarians have always been interested in the signifiers that describe the thing. What the archivists figured out early was, they don't care about that. They want to know about provenance. They want to know where it came from and who had it and who organized it. They actually don't even care how it was organized particularly, but they want to know where it came from, who had it, and who organized it. So the number one thing that archivists will tell you if you say, look, I got all this stuff, I don't know how valuable it is, their first thing will be, don't touch anything. Don't move anything. Don't sort it. Don't go through it, please. Right? They'll get there, they'll look at the, they describe this in linear feet. There were 92 linear feet of records, How often do you hear a librarian say, I don't know, somewhere over there we have 133 feet of stuff, right? This is how archivists think. Why do they think that way? The way the stuff is put in boxes is information. The way the person who sorted that information and put it into boxes is information. It's like the archaeologists on a dig. Where they find the stuff, the strata, the proximity of things next to each other in three-dimensional space. All extremely important information about what was really going on. The artifacts themselves, yeah, they're important, but it's just as the documents, the manuscripts or the photos or graphics or whatever that are in the archive are important. But this idea that, and this is why the ontologies are overrated thing comes in. For a long time, the archivists and librarians just didn't get along. Now in glorious ecumenical schools like the School of Information at Michigan, they do, but. And this is why we rule. But this is definitely one of the things that's going on in this space. Yeah.
So
Simon in the Sciences of the Artificial talks about going to the moon and reasons about the complexity of the problem. And he argues it's actually not a very complex problem in the following sense that people had a very clear objective. There was no debate about, you know, like other problems, what to do about it. And the United States created a fairly homogeneous organization to address this problem. So how does that relate to your arguments about complexity?
Well, I think it relates directly in the sense that just like we were talking yesterday about complicated versus complex. The moonshot was a complicated thing to do. And once you mastered the complicatedness of it, it was tractable. There was nothing emergent about the moonshot. I mean, systems could fail like Apollo 13 or whatever, but, you know, the orbital mechanics, that was really bankable stuff. It was the orbital mechanics that saved Apollo 13, right? The free return trajectory. So, if you have the means to master how complicated the problem is, you can do even enormously complicated things like the moon mission. But if the problem has to do with people's feelings, impressions, views, if it has to do with politics, like teacher in space, then you run into a different set of problems. You know, a lot of people think the Challenger accident was, you know, because of politics, not because of engineering. So anyway, who gets this next?
Polly.
Oh.
Right. So the next one, Polly, talk about researching about this stuff.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, Basil.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to that. Well, there is a difference when you're designing something for a focused mission as opposed to designing for a heterogeneous community. The kind of complexity that you come into the picture is totally different. I mean, I think the design process Microsoft uses to please a large variety of users across multiple continents is quite different than the process NASA has to use to get to the next stage in terms of like space exploration. It's a different set of problems, and it's not. It's focused. It's very organized. It is very methodical, and like John said, there is a very. It's not a really a democracy kind of thing in terms of when it comes to design.